Good afternoon. It's a bit loud, isn't it? The work I'm talking about today is part of a large ARC linkage grant, and there's many industry partners and other funding bodies that you can see acknowledged by all the logos there. So in South Australia there are around 350 species of terrestrial orchids, and around a third of them have been listed as threatened. And orchids have a number of interactions with various organisms in their environment. Obviously, a lot of them rely on pollinators to set fruit. There's also other animals around that find them tasty, and quite a high proportion of flowers and capsules are grazed. Then there's the other plants in the habitat which might act to provide food resources and nesting resources for the pollinators. And they also might help to conceal orchids from the grazers, or they might attract grazers to the environment as well. And if all goes well, the end product of these interactions from the orchid's point of view is to set fruit and go on to release seed. So what happens when you throw something like fire, and in particular prescribed burn, into this background of interactions? And it is said by many that orchids flower more profusely after fire, and even if this was the case, we don't know what happens to populations of pollinators after fire. So increased flowering doesn't necessarily mean that there will be an increase in pollination. And we don't know what happens to the populations of the grazers after fire as well. So an increase in pollination might not necessarily lead to an increase in seed release if there's a change in grazing pressure as a response to fire. So one of the aims of this project was to look at what effects prescribed burns have on orchid flowering and emergence, and also on their reproductive success. So we looked at 4 prescribed burns in the Mount Lofty Ranges, and each had an adjacent control site. There was 1 autumn burn in 2013 and 3 spring burns. And I looked at 4 species of orchids: Caladinia rigida, Tentaculata berrii, they're all spider orchids, and Glossodia major. So just briefly going through an orchid life cycle. They produce a tuber which is dormant over summer below ground, and a proportion of those go on to emerge mid to late autumn. They produce either a single leaf or a bud, and a proportion remain dormant. And then in spring they flower, hopefully set seed, and release that seed in late spring. And they release thousands of tiny dust-like seeds, and only a small proportion, less than 1%, actually germinate, and of those only a small proportion actually go on to produce a seedling that lasts for a year, the following year. So today I'm just going to talk about the results mainly from one of the prescribed burns, and that's the autumn prescribed burn carried out at Millbrook Reservoir in April 2013. And here I tagged 2 species of orchids, Caladinia rigida and Glossodia major. And they're both generalist species pollinated by a suite of insects, including native bees and flies. And the data was collected from 2012 before the burn through to 2015. So looking at Caladinia rigida and its emergence patterns in 2013, so 6 months after the burn, and you can see at the control site 75% of them flowered, 12.5% didn't emerge, and the rest produced a leaf. If we look at what happened after the autumn burn 6 months later, 97% did not emerge, and none of them produced a flower. So there was definitely no observed increase in flowering following that prescribed burn, and there was a large increase in the number of plants that didn't emerge. In 2014, things were looking a bit better. 32% flowered at the burn site, but still 51% didn't emerge. And then in 2015, in January, the Samson Flat bushfires went through a lot of my sites, including the Millbrook sites. It burnt the Millbrook control site, so now I have a bushfire site, and it didn't burn the autumn burn site, so that was now the control. So looking firstly at the non-affected bushfire site on the right, which is the prescribed burn site, this year 43% flowered, 43% didn't emerge. And at the control site, which was affected by the bushfire, 44% didn't emerge, 46% flowered. So now you're looking, well, most importantly on the left at the control site, there's still no increase in flowering as a result of that burn. And at first glance you might look at that and say, well, emergence rates looks pretty similar now, so prescribed burn's pretty much back to normal. But if we look more closely at those non-emergent plants, and now in red, look at the ones that haven't re-emerged for 3 years in a row, and 37% haven't emerged since that fire. And that's a concern, because from other species, other Caladinia species, it's been shown that a plant that doesn't re-emerge for 2 to 3 years is likely to be dead. So there's a potential for having longer term impacts on that population, like we might have wiped out a third of those plants. For Glossodia major, 15% didn't re-emerge in 3 consecutive years compared to 0% at the control site, so at the control all of them emerged once at least. And for the spring burns there was little to no impact on the other species, Caladinia berrii, tentaculata, and for Glossodia major. So why might there be this difference between the autumn burn and the spring burn? If we go back to the life cycle, the autumn burn happened in early April. And although the leaves themselves hadn't started emerging at the time of the fire, it's quite possible that they were just below the surface, and the apical buds of those orchids were probably scorched by that burn, leading to the reduction in emergence that year and possibly also to the death of those tubers. Whereas the spring burn occurs in late spring, by that time the orchids are getting ready to go back into their dormancy phase and probably less susceptible to the effects of those burns. And of course bushfires happen in summer, the orchids are dormant underground. Looking quickly at what happened to reproductive success, and here I looked at pollination, so interactions with pollinators, so just looking at fruit set, and seed release, which is an interaction with pollinators and the herbivores as a measure of what seeds actually get released at the end of that season. And the reason for looking at this is because grazing levels are quite high, even in unburnt areas, up to 82% of flowers and capsules are grazed. And the main culprits are the white-winged chough on the left and the grey currawong seen there on the right. Turns out orchids are quite tasty. So, looking at the results from the autumn burn, there was a reduction in pollination, an increase in grazing rates, and an overall reduction in seed release as a result of the lower fruit set. And the reason this may have been, maybe there were fewer pollinators around after that autumn burn, but we have a PhD student looking at pollinator communities and their response to fire, and she's found no evidence for a reduction in pollinators at that burn. So more likely it's just to do with the fact that there were fewer flowers. There were hardly any flowers after that burn for the pollinators to even find. So the impacts appear to be short-term though, because by 2014 levels of pollination, grazing, seed release were quite similar between the control and the autumn burn site. Spring burn had very little to no impact on pollination, grazing or seed release, but up to 56% of capsules, seed pods, at some of those burns were destroyed by the fire, so that seed crop was lost. If we look now at what happened after the bushfire, quite different results to both of those prescribed burns. There was an increase, quite a big increase in pollination rates, and this is again for Caladinia rigida that I'm showing there. 65% produced fruit, which was way higher than I'd seen in any of the previous years. And grazing rates increased even further, up to 93%. And overall, even though we had that great increase in pollination, only 3% actually got to release their seed because so many of them were eaten either at the flower stage or as a capsule. So why might there have been an increase in pollination after that bushfire? Well, if you can see from the photo there, there's very little understory vegetation left. And apart from the orchid flowers themselves, there were very few other flowering species, so there was just less competition. The pollinators had no choice but to go and visit an orchid flower if they wanted it. And also the flowers are obviously more conspicuous in amongst that background, and perhaps even the herbivores are more desperate for food because there's not much else around for them. So even though there was an increase in pollination, there was no increase in seed release. So some of the implications from this research from a management perspective, obviously season of burn is an important factor to consider. As I showed you, Autumn burns reduced the emergence and possibly led to the death of quite a large proportion of the orchid plants. Whereas the spring burn destroys the seeds produced in that year, and the responses were quite different to those seen after a bushfire. Orchids' reproductive success varies greatly from one year to the other, and their recruitment rates are notoriously low. So it's been estimated that 2 to 4 capsules are required to produce one new orchid plant. So given that these years that are favourable for reproduction and recruitment might be quite sparse and maybe becoming even more infrequent as our climate changes, it might be worth considering avoiding or putting off burns in those years that are going to be good for seed production, and ideally you'd avoid burning the following year so that you allow those seeds to actually go on and recruit. Patchiness of the burn is another important aspect. The reason only 56% of those capsules were burnt was because those spring burns that I looked at were quite patchy burns, and so there was a proportion of plants that weren't affected by the fire. Burn frequency, the seedlings of these orchids, the tubers are quite shallow in the soil surface, so we want to allow enough time for those tubers to reach depths where they're safe from fire, so not burning too frequently to let them get down to a mature depth. Life history traits to consider, depending on if you're looking at a particular species, looking at their life history attributes and how they might respond to fire. And obviously grazing has a major impact on these populations of orchids, even in areas that weren't burnt by the fires. So it might be worth starting to think about ways we can reduce the impact of grazing, particularly in those in the period when the orchids are in flower. Thank you very much. I'd just like to acknowledge a bunch of people that have helped along the way. Thank you.
Does anyone have a question?
So I noticed you had a grey currawong wandering around in a burnt habitat.
I was thinking you might pick that up.
So, I mean, that's an interesting example of how there might be some indirect effects of those bird responses, vegetation or other aspects. Are there any other indirect kind of, or other effects that particularly those birds might have in these sorts of habitats?
Because
well, if you have different, if those sorts of birds come in.
yes, except that even on the unburnt sites, the white-winged choughs, 82% of them are still being grazed. So, yes, I don't have data of the populations of the actual birds before and after those fires. So it's possible that they are indeed attracted after fires to a higher level, or that the flowers are more visible. But yes, I can't tell you that there were more birds there.
Any other questions? Alright, move on to our last speaker. Thank you.